my name is Michael Dewan Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach in private practice in London. This video is the second under the title Politics in Psychotherapy, which is also under a broader series that I'm doing that I've titled Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. In this video, I want to talk about how a therapist might skillfully address and engage with clients around social and political issues that impact them in their lives. In my last video, under the title Politics in Psychotherapy, I provided a historical and a conceptual context for this. It could be useful to go back, I think, and watch that video. It'll help you make more sense of what I'm going to say in this video. But I can summarize very briefly. I made an argument that it's right and valid that critical social justice and woke psychotherapy have shone a light on this dimension of the human experience and made the argument that engaging this in therapy is valid. So I embrace that. However, I also provided a critique and a challenge about the reductive and ideological ways that it goes about this and the consequences on the practice of psychotherapy, which I think are not good and can actually cause harm. So what I want to do in this video is begin to provide a way forward without neglecting the good intentions and the valid points that woke psychotherapy makes. I also want to share, as I did in my last video, that my ideas about this were developed during a 5-year period where I taught a course on diversity to students of psychotherapy who were working toward their qualification as psychotherapists. So I've done some deep reflection and been immersed in these ideas and this material, and what I have to offer has come out of that. Now I'd like to offer 7 basic guidelines for engaging with clients around social and political issues that may affect them. There's plenty more that can and I probably will say, but this I think is a good start, and I've tried to identify what seems most important to me. The first guideline is to recognize and accept as a therapist who's being paid for their services that your job is to serve the client's needs and well-being. It's not to engage in social activism. This is a fundamental and important first principle, I think, that what we do and what we say in therapy should serve the well-being of the client. If you happen to be a social justice activist and you have those beliefs and you're engaged in that elsewhere in your life, fine. Go for it. That's not a role that you bring into psychotherapy. An analogy that might be illustrated here is that, for myself, I'm a psychotherapist. I'm also a husband. Now, if I decide that I'm going to treat my wife like a psychotherapy client, she's going to get irritated, understandably, justifiably. And I need to back away from that. I don't need to double down and press on it and decide in psychotherapeutic language that she's just resistant. This is not the way marriages are supposed to work, right? It's very similar in psychotherapy. It's not the place to be a social justice warrior. It's the place to be a therapist. The second principle that I would offer is to get to know your client as thoroughly as possible. Do a complete initial assessment. Continually update that assessment throughout therapy. Make corrections and adjustments and modifications and updates so that you're trying to stay as accurate as possible to this actual person in front of you. You might consider using what I've offered in a previous video around the 4 quadrants of the integral theory, which you could say is body, mind, relationships, and environment. These are fundamental perspectives that can be lenses through which we look in understanding somebody, so that we're not reducing it to just one or the other. As we get to know somebody as thoroughly as possible, what I think we should avoid is reducing them to a stereotype, taking one observation and making too much out of it. If a person happens to belong to a particular identity group, whether it's privileged or marginalized, this could be important to know, but to avoid reducing them to a caricature of what we think about that particular category. And to keep going and develop an understanding of the unique individual before us until they really are a unique individual and they're not somebody we can reduce to categories. This is true for dealing with social and political issues, right? But it's also something I've long said about mental health diagnoses, that none of us should be reduced to our diagnoses. We're first a person with a rich, diverse way of being, and we can't be reduced. Guideline number 3, understand and address the client's issues as they present them. We can thank person-centered psychotherapy for redirecting us in this way. Once upon a time, I believe that a person-centered approach arose because it's observation that therapy had tended to diagnose people and tell them what their problems were and then what they needed to do to fix those problems. Person-centered approach takes the perspective of the client. I think this is important. This is something that I think woke psychotherapy has forgotten. For instance, a middle-aged white man who comes into therapy and he's lost his job and he's been diagnosed with cancer and his wife has left him all within the last 6 months, doesn't really need to hear about how he's privileged. That's not the agenda for therapy. It's to address what's happened to him and how he's going to handle it. In my own practice, usually in the second session, in the first session, we're getting to know each other. I'm gathering a lot of information. The second session, almost invariably, clients don't know where to start. They look to me. And most of the time, what I do is ask them to summarize in a sentence or a phrase why it is they've come to therapy, what they want to be different because of coming to therapy. And I say, we'll use that as our North Star. If we get lost or we don't know what to talk about or where we're going, we'll remember this. And this is in their words, their ideas, not my words, not my ideas. And this is the North Star. This is what the client wants out of therapy. In the first session, they've already begun to address this, often in a lot of language. But by focusing in on a phrase or a sentence, it makes it easier to remember and refer to. Guideline number 4. I suggest that the therapist be well aware of their own political views, their own passionately held values and beliefs, their own moral stance on things, and bracket that. This is a well-known therapeutic stance called bracketing, and what it basically means is suspending your bias so that you're not listening to a client and measuring what they say against what you think is right, but you're being non-judgmental. You're being curious and empathic and helping them to explore things on their own. You're remaining aware of and sensitive to the ways that you're different, maybe cultural differences, and promoting their autonomy in thinking through things, in feeling through things, in deciding how to act, and helping them arrive at a place that feels true and coherent for them. It doesn't mean that we can't introduce other possible perspectives for their consideration, but we're not trying to shoehorn them into what we think is true. We're helping them arrive at their own conclusions. The other aspect of this is that in terms of privilege and marginalization, we can make a mistake to decide that we share more with somebody because we happen to share one immutable trait, like being a man or a woman or being white or whatever, and assume too much shared. There may be more differences than we realize, or we might make false assumptions about how we're different from somebody because there's one category of difference that we are overemphasizing and not realizing that we have more shared experiences with the person. So it's to not make assumptions and to not judge, but to hold a space for deep inquiry, with the emphasis being on the autonomy of the client to arrive where they need to arrive. Guideline number 5. Now I want to address and begin to make some suggestions about how to proceed when we've determined that social or political context for a client's life is relevant to their presenting problem. Before I do that, I want to share some personal experience. Once upon a time, I was persuaded that it would be a good idea to bring these issues up regardless of any evidence that they were relevant for a client. For instance, in working with Black clients on several occasions, I would ask, how does it feel to you to work with a white person? And almost every time, mostly, I would get a perplexed look, like, why are you asking me that? How is that relevant? And there would be a bit of an awkwardness, and then we'd move on, and I would drop it. Ultimately, I decided not to ask this question anymore unless I saw some sign that there was something going on. Then, of course, I would bring it up. But to introduce it without any immediate context for it didn't make sense, so I quit doing it. But when it comes out, perhaps a client says something, or we pick up on something and we ask, and they begin to talk, then what we do, I believe, is rather than educate them and drawing a lot of conclusions, we remain curious. We ask questions about what has happened. Who did what? When? How did they feel about it? What did they say or do at the time? What did they think about saying or doing at the time, but perhaps they didn't? Is there any other way to interpret their experience or the behavior of other people? The point here is to not draw conclusions, but to remain curious and allow the person to describe their experience fully and validate their feelings and their thoughts, given their interpretation. Again, there may be an opportunity to bring their curiosity to another way to interpret what happened that might leave them feeling differently, but to simply let them tell you, as a therapist, what this experience meant to them. Sometimes we may be aware of social and cultural forces around a client that are impacting them in ways that they're not yet aware of. So yes, they may not be woke, so to speak. In that case, what I think is useful is to propose it as something to be curious about. Have you ever considered this? Do you think maybe you've encountered racism or sexism or homophobia in some way? Is that, and the thing is to not offer that as a proclamation of what's true, but to just invite the client to consider the possibility. This may lead to a really rich conversation and a useful way forward. In my own work, when I pick up that a client is struggling with a deep sense of shame, that may be coming from internalized judgments that they're picking up from their social environment, I might inquire into this. For instance, if a woman is preoccupied with her physical appearance and ashamed about her lack of attractiveness, I may ask her whether she thinks cultural standards for beauty that are imposed on women has anything to do with this. Or if it's a man who is feeling shame about his emotional vulnerabilities, I may ask him whether he thinks that the cultural standards for men to be stoic and emotionally stable, mixed with an increasing message from the culture that men should be open and emotionally vulnerable, are confusing or difficult for him. I do this in the sense of a phrase something like, have you ever considered that maybe? And leave it to the person to think about it themselves. I don't insist on this, and if it doesn't strike a bell or sound true or seem fruitful, I back off. But I will plant seeds like that. And again, this is not some kind of imported agenda. This is directly related to what is happening in the room and what is happening with the client in front of me and what it is they are directly struggling with. So guideline number 5, to summarize it quickly, is to open a space for deep inquiry into the client's experience in every dimension possible and letting them tell you what it is without making any assumptions about it. Guideline number 6. This one's difficult to articulate. I think it's more of a principle. But having spent the time, made the effort to inquire into, to be with, and to empathize with a client in whatever pain that they've experienced due to their social environment, due to however they've been mistreated, we could say, or we could ask, now what? Now what do we do? And I think that woke psychotherapy doesn't address this enough for me. And the first thing I think we could do is avoid helping them to solidify a victim mentality. They may well have experienced victimization, but this doesn't mean that their identity needs to be focused on that. Instead, we can direct them toward their own agency, their own sense of personal power. What is it they want to do about what has happened to them, if anything? Do they need to set some boundaries somewhere? Do they need to advocate for themselves? Do they need to remove themselves from certain places? Do they need to cut certain people out of their lives? What do they need to do to feel empowered to hold their dignity and their rights and pursue their own goals? To not lose track of their goals? To not think that because of this experience, somehow they're doomed. They're just a victim. Is to avoid that and to work toward empowerment so that the person can begin to develop perhaps a plan and a strategy with the therapist's assistance to continue to pursue their goals or to address the injustice that they have experienced in some way. There's definitely a place for this. Guideline number 7. Allow for the possibility that social justice issues may not be relevant and need to be explicitly addressed in every psychotherapy. Now, the therapist should have it on their radar and be able to pick up on it if it is, but not to just bring it in unless it gets picked up on. It seems that woke psychotherapy can make a case for it always being relevant. There's always some way in which an argument can be made that it's impacting the person. My suggestion is if you have to think hard and make big logical leaps about this that aren't related to what is actually in front of you and the person that you're working with, you remain skeptical of that and not artificially import it into the situation. For instance, when I meet with people initially, I do an assessment, and I will cover things like alcohol and drug addiction and see if those are an issue. I will do a risk assessment and see whether suicidality or self-harm is in the history or something to pay attention to. If it isn't an issue, I don't keep pressing on it. And I suggest the same for social justice issues. Something I didn't say earlier, but I think it's worth reflecting on this. If, for instance, we bring it in with somebody who hasn't shown anything, and for instance, a white therapist with a person of color, to say, how do you feel about the fact that as a white person I'm privileged, and as a brown or black person you're really in a marginalized, disadvantaged position in our society? How do you feel about that? Think about that. What message does that convey? Does that convey a sense of welcoming and connecting? Does that build a therapeutic alliance, or does that somehow set up this weird polarity where the therapist is assuming they're in a superior position and the client is in a disempowered, disenfranchised position? Well, on the surface that may seem like you're trying to do the just and right thing and be mindful and compassionate about their potential experience. It communicates this other message that I don't think fosters a good therapeutic relationship. Now, if it comes up later, and this is not just the social context in the person's life, but if it comes up in the therapeutic relationship that the person is struggling with you being of a different ethnicity, if you pick up on that, definitely it should be explored. It should be brought into the room, and the therapist should be willing to inquire into and listen to the client and not be defensive and work that through. But to bring it up in the beginning, assuming that not only is the social world around the person relevant to their presenting problem, but that your own ethnicity is a problem for them based on who's the oppressor and who's being oppressed. Not a good move. I just cannot get behind that. So to summarize my last guiding principle, don't assume that social justice issues are relevant for every client. Allow for the possibility that they won't need to be addressed explicitly. Like every other topic I've made a video on, there's plenty more that could be said on this topic. However, for now, I offer these 7 guidelines for how to engage with clients when social or political issues are impacting their lives. Again, I want to make the point that it can be very important and valuable to do this, and that we can thank woke psychotherapy for pointing this out and making such a strong argument for it. At the same time, a zealous embrace of a new truth can lead to excesses that diminish awareness of other important truths. What starts with good intentions can morph into something that actually causes harm. My aim in this video has been to preserve the good intentions and the valid truths that are presented by woke psychotherapy, while avoiding the harm that can be caused when those good intentions are hijacked by the ambition to promote an ideology. Well, that's it for now. If you liked this video, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel, share this video with a friend, leave me comments, and be well, take care, and I will see you hopefully in the next video. Bye-bye.